Private members' business, consideration at second reading of Bill C-311, Violence Against Pregnant Women Act, standing in the name of Mrs. Wagantall.
Mrs. Wagantall, seconded by Ms. Finley, moves that Bill C-311, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Violence Against Pregnant Women, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Debate. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Hear, hear.
Speaker, I'm honoured to open what I seek to be a respectful debate on Private Members Bill 311, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Violence Against Pregnant Women. I stand this evening on behalf of pregnant women who have been and are facing violence while living in fear of injury or loss of their child. I stand humbly advocating on behalf of those who no longer breathe or have their voice, and on behalf of their families who have lost loved ones whose lives were taken in targeted violent crimes. There are more than 80 cases in recent Canadian history of women who have been killed while pregnant. Each of these women were killed by men who knew that they were pregnant. The killers intentionally sought to do harm to the pregnant women and in many cases end their pregnancies. As it stands at this moment, we in this place have failed them by not requiring sentencing judges to take these actions into account. The Violence Against Pregnant Women Act is simple. It will amend the Criminal Code to ensure that the act of knowingly assaulting a pregnant woman and causing physical or emotional harm to a pregnant woman are factored in as aggravating circumstances for sentencing purposes. A perpetrator has been identified, they have been found guilty, and the sentence must be required to match the crime. Every one of us in this place carries the responsibility as legislators to do everything that we can in our roles to denounce and to deter gender-based violence in all of its forms. Canada is failing its pregnant women and the children they have chosen to carry to term. C-311, Violence Against Pregnant Women, reflects our ability to fill this gap in the Criminal Code of Canada. The first question each of us in this place must answer to determine whether we seek to denounce and deter violence against pregnant women is, do we truly value women and their choice to be pregnant? Jeff Durham and Sherry Goberden, who spoke to reporters this morning and were with us today, represent families who've been discouraged by the lack of will in this place to champion the choices of Cassie and Ariana to be pregnant and to raise Molly and Asara. Jeff says, and I'm quoting, "Part of what has been lost in this debate is viability of a woman's choice. Two sides of an option make up a choice. You can't protect only one side and still call it a choice. It's crazy to me that the argument on one side is against the choice of a woman. I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of reproductive rights. Like, how can we call them reproductive rights and then not extend them to the ones that choose to reproduce? It is absurd. Someone who believes that such a choice belongs to a woman should be the strongest advocate for something like this. The pro-choice community has become disillusioned," he says. "They are seeing themselves used as fodder for political gain by politicians, advocacy groups, media, and this Prime Minister, all who refuse to value specifically protecting a woman's choice to be pregnant, to carry her child to term, to be protected from intimate partner violence, gender-based violence within Canada's Criminal Code." Jeff is not alone. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of Canadians agree. A position paper outlining 6 reasons to oppose this bill was sent to all parliamentarians. Oh, except me. The author, Joyce Arthur, Executive Director of Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, who supported this bill when it was part of Cassie and Molly's law, has changed her mind and validates that change of heart with these following reasons. So first of all, she says the bill is redundant, as other clauses in the Criminal Code section can cover pregnant victims. Well, I have to tell you, in researching through many references of previous cases, judges' discretion in using other clauses or choosing to see pregnancy as an aggravating circumstance is truly wanting. Only 2 of many examples I will give you. R.V. Cunningham, 2023, states, "This is another tragic case of someone attempting to end the life of a pregnant woman. The appeal seems to hinge on the unfairness of the sentence, but what is interesting is that there are no indications that the fact she was pregnant factored into the sentence whatsoever." R.V. Cormody, 2019, states, "The trial judge did not address the significance of domestic violence. including the fact that the victim was pregnant with a respondent's child, as well as that the attack represented an obvious desire to kill her, to solve his own problem of unexpected parenthood. Then she said, more effective measures are needed to address gender-based violence. I agree. I couldn't agree more. Any and every measure we can implement to better protect women when pregnant should be taken. Last week, I had a call from a young woman who, while pregnant, feared for her life and the life of her child. With the challenges she's facing now, limited income from food prices that are skyrocketing, inability to work because she wants to take care of her own newborn, waiting for room in a shelter, finding a home she could afford, having all of her belongings, credit card, bank accounts stolen by her abusive and threatening husband. She is nothing short of a strong, determined, and very brave woman. Every measure we can implement to better facilitate pregnant women facing violence must be taken. This remarkable woman called me and thanked me for bringing forward the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act. And yet, what does Joyce Arthur say? I'm quoting her. Such protections could hypothetically include a degree of legal protection, but only if that would meet a real need according to the anti-gender-based violence community, and only if the focus was on the pregnant person and their needs and not on the pregnancy itself or the fetus. Partner Jeff Durham, mother Sherry Goberdin, and this young woman who was assaulted and abused, they are clearly members of the anti-gender-based violence community. Their extended families are clearly members of the anti-gender-based violence community. Yet their voices are being denied by what is truly an extreme claim that only one choice matters. I encourage those who will vote in this place to be brave enough to go to mollymatters.org to see and hear of many more victims of gender-based violence that are shunned by the statement that has further traumatized those being told that they and their loved ones have no place within the anti-gender-based violence community, and they are the ones who have faced all this violence. She then says no anti-violence group is known to support this bill. She then goes on to list organizations that she's aware of that support the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act, and she defines them as anti-choice groups and implies that because they support this bill, they are not anti-violence groups. Merriam-Webster defines anti-violence as acting against or opposing violence, where violence is defined as the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy, and an instance of violent, harmful, destructive treatment or procedure. Just as the majority of the pro-choice community is being misrepresented in these reasons not to support C-311, the same can be said of the pro-life community. Yet the desire to see pregnancy as an aggravating circumstance is supported by the vast majority of Canadians across the entire spectrum. The bill has and is receiving endorsements from other cultures and faith-based groups who support its intent to denounce and deter violence, such as the Overseas Friends of India Canada and the Pakistan Canadian Cultural Association and others. Pregnancy counseling centers, safe spaces for women who are facing violence during pregnancy, support denouncing and deterring that violence by seeing the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act supported unanimously in this place. And yet, what is this government doing? They want to revoke their charitable status. On their website, Pregnancy Care Canada states, and I'm quoting, "For a woman to truly have a choice regarding her unexpected pregnancy, she must have authentic options to choose from, including the option to continue her pregnancy." End quote. I will encourage those who will vote on this bill to review the findings in the 2016 Nanos poll, Canadians' Opinions on Crimes Against Pregnant Women. Nick was surprised that it clearly indicated 70% of all Canadians and 73% of all Canadian women want to see pregnancy as an aggravating circumstance in Canada's criminal code. They believe and want it to happen. Well, and then, Speaker, the motivation, she says, behind this bill is suspect. Where have I heard that before? Right? Where are we hearing it today? On all kinds of social media. Dangerous, dangerous. I have to say, what she is really saying is that the motivation behind the bill being suspect, she's actually saying that the bill is suspect because it was put forward by me. What a demeaning attitude towards an issue that is so important to women in this country.
That's right.
And yet, she supported this very bill herself when it was part of my previous bill that called for protections for pregnant women in the criminal code. She saw that unity amongst most Canadians existed then for what has now been written as the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act, period. Joyce Arthur expressed support for my previous bill, but said if only the aggravating circumstances portion was what was kept. That is what C-311 is. At this point, she was on side with most Canadians. She stated, and I'm quoting, "Because pregnant women are more vulnerable to violence and abuse than non-pregnant women, they fit into the reasoning for aggravating factors." And she said ARC would be willing to support it, especially if it might give some redress and comfort to victims and their families. I can tell you that victims and families across this nation have sensed anything but support from this government when they have chosen to carry their children and face these kind of violent circumstances that were no choice of theirs. It's deplorable. And yet, she did not stand in the gap, challenge the government of the day to support the bill going to committee to consider this amendment. I wonder why. Unfortunately then, and we will witness today what extent in further debate today, current members of Parliament either support or fail to represent the view of the majority of Canadians on the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act. Why do supposed anti-gender-based violence organizations and politicians refuse to prioritize the safety and security of women when they're pregnant? What's going on there? Why do they choose to turn a deaf ear to the vast majority of Canadians who want to see this bill passed? What is the motivation for that? Canadians have woken up to what some of that motivation is. What I find most incomprehensible is when women fail women. There is no justification for any reason for any woman, including in this place, to sacrifice the choice of another woman to carry her child to term, to deny their value, to deny what we can do in this place to bring further protections to those women who are attacked, who are killed, who face all kinds of violence. And we are ignoring them in this place for another agenda. And then she says, the bill is already being used to promote fetal rights. I have something to say to you, Joyce. It is also being used by those who deny fetal rights. And that is wrong on all levels. And the majority of Canadians support this, which means across the entire spectrum of Canadians, whatever their views are, they see this as something is absolutely crucial to saying that when a woman is pregnant, when she is carrying a child, I don't know about you, but with all of these reveals, come on, what do? They say, I'm having a baby, and I am calling him or her this. Ariana, named Sarah. Jeff and Cassie, named Molly. This is normal behavior. And we are acting as though it's something we don't want to see happen, that we protect these women. And yet again, along with other significant findings, the 2016 Nanos poll, look it up, Canadians' opinions on crimes against women indicate 70% of all Canadians, 73% of women in Canada want to see pregnancy as an aggravating circumstance in Canada's criminal code. We as legislators must respond to the clear consensus of Canadians. It is fully within Parliament's role to amend Canada's criminal code to ensure that the act of knowingly assaulting a pregnant woman and causing physical or emotional harm to a pregnant woman are factored in as aggravating circumstances for sentencing purposes. Well, Speaker, a couple of more thoughts. She ends with this final point of her 6 points. 2 Liberal MPs immediately saw through the bill. Really. Saw through the bill. Apparently today a whole bunch more saw through the bill. A press meeting this morning, conference while mine was on, was seeing through the bill. Listen, these 2 female Liberals and others who are taking that stand and turning a blind eye to this need. Sorry. Yeah. Are joint.
And that is time up. Apologies, yes. Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been reported earlier today that the Conservative leader, the member for Carleton, will support Bill C-311. I would like to ask my honourable colleague if she can confirm that in this House, because you see, Madam Speaker, the well-known anti-abortion group Campaign for Life Coalition was very surprised by this news. They said that they were happily surprised, but even they were surprised by this news. I would also like to ask my honourable colleague if the Conservative leader agrees with her statement, quote, that the lack of abortion law in Canada constitutes a legal void. These are the arguments that my colleague from Yorkton Melville put forward to justify her Bill C-311. Does the Conservative leader agree with that, Madam Speaker?
The member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the question. My leader supports this bill. And I was asked at my press conference today, you weren't there, whether, oh, I'm sorry, Speaker, you weren't there either. I apologize. I apologize. That being said, my leader supports the bill because it is reasonable and it reflects the views of Canadians of valuing family. And I was asked then at my press conference, so does that mean everyone on your side of the floor is obviously going to support it? And I'll get to that. And at the same time, I said, you know what? We are different in the Conservative Party. Because what I said to him as we discussed this, we are different, believe me, very different. People see the difference. That I don't want anyone on my side of the floor in this party to have to feel what every other person in this House experiences when there's a vote that their leader has an attitude about. I said I want every member of my party to have the freedom to vote their conscience. And that is something that is dead in this House, except for over here.
I have to give the opportunity for others to ask questions. Honorable député de Shefford.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question for my colleague for Yorkton Melville. In her speech, she spoke of a majority of Canadians. But it is certainly not a majority of Quebecers. She spoke about the Conservative difference, and I would talk about the Quebec difference. Recently, the Quebec Minister for the Status of Women said that she was concerned about women's right to an abortion. Does my colleague realize that her bill constitutes a threat and may lead to significant backtracking on women's rights? A struggle for women's rights that Quebec women have been fighting for so long.
Thank you to the member for the question. That's pretty typical. It's hogwash.
Yeah, that's right.
You're in government. These people are in government. You can make whatever decision you want in regard to abortion access. The majority of Canadians want access to abortion. But the majority of Canadians also want protection for women who choose to take to raise their children, to carry them to term. That is what Jeff was saying, who is a pro-choice person, as was Cassie. He said, what has happened here? The definition of pro-choice has been hijacked, and he wants it back because he lost Molly and he lost Cassie, and they are totally disregarded by that community and by this government and these people.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I know my honourable colleague is very passionate about the issue, but I don't think it's the issue at hand. In fact, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada opposes this bill and is urging MPs to oppose the bill. At the same time, anti-choice organizations, including the Pro-Life Coalition, are cheering on the introduction of the bill because they see it as a step towards establishing legal protection for fetuses, which would pave way for restriction on abortion. Now, I don't want to, Madam Speaker, go back to the time where we had to use coat hangers and back lanes to get abortions. I don't want to go back to a time where we have to fight for little children who have been victims of sexual assault to not have, and we're seeing in the States, not having access to abortions, including 10-year-olds. Yeah. So I'm going to ask a yes or no question. Does my honourable colleague support a women's right to a safe abortion? Does she support a women's right to a safe abortion?
I will give the honourable member for Yorkton Melville 20 seconds for an answer.
It is time for this House that has its own agenda to stop gaslighting Canadians. Okay? It's time. There is a desire across this nation, regardless of perspectives, and I can assure you of that because I see and hear it all the time. A lot of the pro-choice community is still very nervous.
Debate, reprise du débat, l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du ministère.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism.
Sorry. We have resumed the debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madame la Présidente, je me lève aujourd'hui pour parler du projet de loi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-311, which would amend the criminal code to specify that knowingly assaulting a pregnant woman and that causing physical or emotional harm to a pregnant woman are to be considered aggravating circumstances for sentencing purposes. And when you first look at this, well, that seems like a well-intentioned measure to protect pregnant women. But a more in-depth examination of the language in the bill would suggest that its real objective is to reopen the abortion debate in Canada.
C-311 is the most recent iteration, Madam Speaker, of a number of similar previous private members' bills. In 2016, the same Conservative member introduced Bill C-225, which proposed to add an offence for injuring or causing the death of a preborn child while committing an offence. That proposed legislation was defeated due to the concerns that its proposed offence would have conferred rights on fetuses, thereby compromising abortion rights in this country. While that Conservative bill explicitly mentioned preborn children, Bill C-311 seems to take a more indirect approach, Madam Speaker, but to arrive at the exact same result. And Madam Speaker, I will say, I understand why my colleague felt it necessary to be so indirect in her tactics to further her goal. After all, the Conservative member's previous attempts through Bill C-225 was not only soundly defeated, with members of all other parties in this House voting to reject that Conservative bill, but Madam Speaker, over 20 Conservative MPs could not even bring themselves to vote for it, and a few Conservative members even voted against it, including the member for Wellington-Halton Hills, which I think underlies some of the reasons why so many of us in this House thinks so highly of that particular member. Madam Speaker, j'aimerais maintenant parler un peu plus sur pourquoi je m'oppose.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say now that I'm opposed to this Conservative bill for two major reasons. First of all, it seems to have been designed to serve as a founding point to reopen the abortion debate in Canada.
Some silence while the honourable member was making her speech. There was silence while the sponsor of the bill was making her speech. I would like to ask the same courtesy to be accorded to the current speaker, the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Ce projet de loi semble...
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill seems to have been designed as a stepping stone to reopen the debate on abortion in Canada, with the goal of conferring rights on fetuses. Let us be very clear. Our government remains very firmly convinced that the right to an abortion is protected by the Charter, and we will never, never compromise that right. Secondly, this bill contains errors which would make it ineffective in obtaining its own objective. I will now explain how this bill would actually reduce the legal tools available for pregnant women who are victims of assault. I understand, of course, that violence towards pregnant women is a serious problem, and a type of gender-based violence which requires a serious criminal response. And the criminal code contains a number of offenses that can apply in the context of gender-based violence. Based on the behavior, there are offenses such as battery, sexual assault, and threats that can all apply, as well as other offenses like criminal harassment, when it has to do with ongoing behavior that can affect the victim's physical or psychological safety. Aggravating circumstances also exist to increase when violence is committed towards a pregnant person, and relevant cases have shown that these cases should be treated very seriously by the courts. In addition to this solid response from the criminal justice system, I am certain that we would all agree that non-legislative solid measures are also necessary to fight all forms of gender-based violence. That is why our government has been continuing to implement its strategy to prevent and counter gender-based violence. This strategy accentuates preventing gender-based violence, as well as supporting survivors and promoting appropriate legal systems.
If you'll allow me, Madam Speaker, I want to speak more directly about the right to choose and abortion rights here in Canada. The Conservative member from Yorkton Melville has stated in this House that her bill is meant to address, quote, the legal void around abortion in Canada. The Conservative member created her own website page for this particular bill, where she linked to a pro-life petition, which she also presented in this chamber in March. That petition advocates for Bill C-311, Madam Speaker, arguing that, quote, preborn children should be considered victims. This language has garnered public support from anti-abortion organizations that seek to strip reproductive freedom from women here in Canada. When someone tells you who they are, Madam Speaker, and what they are doing, believe them. Just last week in this House, the member for Yorkton Melville said, and I quote, Canada has no abortion law, and it is still a huge discussion in our country. Where is this still a huge discussion in our country, Madam Speaker? It's only the Conservatives who want to discuss abortion law in this country, Madam Speaker, because there is certainly no doubt that it is the Conservatives reopening this debate on the floor of this House of Commons here today. Pro-choice organizations, including Abortion is Healthcare, a group from the sponsor's home province of Saskatchewan, and the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada have both spoken out against this Conservative bill. Abortion is Healthcare called C-311 a bill that would slowly moving the fetus towards personhood, Madam Speaker. Let me be clear, abortion is healthcare in this country. A woman's right to choose is hers and hers alone. The government has no role to play in that decision. And we, this government, this Liberal government, will always stand with Canadian women in order to protect their rights.
Hear, hear, hear.
For those that feel that the Conservatives are reopening this debate in Canada is not something that they should be worried about, I would like to share with you, Madam Speaker, part of the conversation on feminist policy that our Deputy Prime Minister had this weekend with Secretary Hillary Clinton. Secretary Clinton said there is a very significant historical struggle going on about whether we move forward or the clock is turned back. Madam Speaker, I raise this because just across our southern border, we see the clock getting turned back. We witnessed U.S. Supreme Court justices and politicians attempt the erasure of decades of feminist struggle for a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. We know that Canadians fought tirelessly for this same right in our country, Madam Speaker, and we will never let it be weakened. Finally, Madam Speaker, I would like to explain why this bill would actually endanger pregnant women. Bill C-311 would reduce the legal tools available to people who are assaulted while pregnant. Sentencing courts already treat the fact that a victim is pregnant as an aggravating factor in the common law. The common law aggravating factor that currently applies is similar to Bill 311, but it provides broader protection because it does not require evidence that the offender knew that the victim was pregnant. I am therefore extremely concerned, Madam Speaker, that the bill's proposed aggravating factor could result in sentencing courts refusing to treat a victim's pregnancy as an aggravating factor in cases where there is no evidence that the offender knew that the victim was pregnant. I do not want pregnant women to suffer from less protection under the law because of this ill-conceived Bill C-311. This Conservative bill would be a step backwards, Madam Speaker, for both pregnant women, for all women, and for all Canadians. I will be voting against this bill and urge every single member of this House to vote against this Conservative bill.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is with great exasperation that I speak tonight on Bill C-311, which amends the Criminal Code to require the court to consider the fact that the victim of assault is a pregnant woman as an aggravating factor in sentencing. I know that it can sound like a delicate issue, but as usual, the Conservatives want to bring back the abortion debate, and this bill is one of many attempts to give legal value to the fetus in an effort to undermine a woman's right to control her own body. I will therefore explain further the perverse effects of this bill, then give a history of Conservative backdoor attempts, and finally a reminder of this difficult struggle for women. First, without explicitly naming the fetus, the bill seeks to create an aggravating factor when the offense of assault is committed against a pregnant woman. In so doing, the Conservative proposal, if adopted, could reinforce the premise that the legislator's intention is to grant an implicit legal status to the fetus. The Bloc Québécois is opposed to any attempt to legislate in this way and to contribute to the rolling back of women's rights. It should be noted that the Criminal Code already allows a judge to impose a sentence by considering the offense as an aggravating factor that has a significant effect on the victim because of the victim's personal circumstances, including health. The victim's personal circumstances may include pregnancy and allow the court to consider this factor as an aggravating factor in the circumstances. Feminicides committed against pregnant women have been documented by Canadian police forces since 2005. According to Statistics Canada, in 2005, 12 feminicides took place in a conjugal context, while 8 pregnant women lost their lives at the hands of a person who was not their spouse. We don't want a single one more. In a Quebec court ruling in 2021, the court addressed the issue in sentencing a man who pleaded guilty to assaulting his ex-wife. The judge was adamant about the impact of such crimes on a pregnant woman, a condition that makes her more vulnerable to assault and less able to defend herself. Quebec and Canadian courts are therefore willing to consider a victim's personal situation, including pregnancy, in sentencing. Our society has a duty to punish violence against women, particularly violence against women who are pregnant, and the mechanisms already exist to do so. The codification sought by the Conservative bill, even if it were proposed in good faith, would therefore have no added value. That said, we have good reasons to believe that it is part of an anti-abortion strategy. Secondly, it's important to note that the Conservative member is back in her ideological war on women's reproductive health. Indeed, in the previous Parliament, she sponsored a bill to criminalize abortions performed on the basis of the sex of the unborn child. So obviously, whatever the Conservative leader says about the pro-choice position, it clearly does not have unanimous support in caucus, and on the contrary, there are still anti-choice members. The Bloc Québécois is therefore opposed to Bill C-311 because it is a disguised strategy to give implicit legal status to the fetus. Bill C-311 is therefore an anti-abortion bill. The Bloc Québécois uncompromisingly defends women's right to control their bodies, women's right to free choice, and the right to free and accessible abortion services. The Conservatives are trying to do indirectly what they cannot do directly. This bill is nothing less than an attempt to codify Canadian law to support their outdated anti-abortion positions that Quebecers have rejected. If passed, this legislative amendment could set a dangerous precedent if a Canadian court were to rule on the issue of abortion right. Our elected officials have a responsibility to exercise their office honestly and to state their true intentions when engaging in dialogue on behalf of the citizens they represent. The health of our democracy depends on it. Disguising discourse for purely ideological purposes undermines the proper functioning of our democracy. So consequently, these practices must be recognized and called out and must stop. The Bloc Québécois demands that the leader of the Conservative Party publicly acknowledge that Bill C-311 is nothing more than a partisan strategy to fight abortion, that he call on his MPs to oppose it, and that he call the member for Yorkton-Melville to order. And I would say that if he does not do so, if he does as he announced today, and he votes for Bill C-311, that says a lot, Madam Speaker, about the influence of religious lobbies with the Conservatives. And in Quebec, laïcité is what we believe in. To take religion out of the state. The member for Yorkton-Melville already has a history of introducing anti-abortion bills. In 2016, she introduced Bill C-225, an act to protect pregnant women and their unborn children, Casey and Molly's Law, which would sentence anyone who directly or indirectly causes the death of the unborn child to life. Is it not curious that the fights led by the member for Yorkton-Melville are never overtly about abortion rights, but all result, in one form or another, in a proposal to criminalize this medical act, which carries severe prison sentences? For all of these reasons, we recommend voting against Bill C-311. It should also be noted that the issue of selective abortion is not new in federal politics. In 2012, a Conservative MP, another one, tabled a motion to condemn it, thereby reopening the abortion issue. This motion followed Conservative Stephen Woodworth's motion on fetal rights, which called for a parliamentary committee to study when a fetus should be considered a human being for the purposes of the Criminal Code homicide provisions. These anti-abortion and backdoor criminalization tactics took place despite former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's election promise not to reopen the abortion debate. Third, it is important to remember that in Canada, women's right to abortion is closely linked to Dr. Henry Morgenthauer's fight to legalize this medical treatment. Before 1969, it was illegal to perform abortions in Canada. Women died because they were using hangers. Do we really want to go back to that, Madam Speaker? In 1969, Parliament made several important changes to the Criminal Code. One of these was on abortion, the Abortion Act, then numbered 237, which specified when an abortion could be legally performed. The provision had criminal sanctions against doctors who did not comply with the strict rules. That same year, Dr. Henry Morgenthaler opened his first clinic in Montreal where he performed abortions. After all sorts of discussions about doctors who had to approve them, a year later he was charged with the illegal practice of abortion. Following the dismissal of his appeal by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1975, he served a 10-month sentence in prison. In 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into force. In 1983, Dr. Morgenthaler, along with other doctors, was charged with illegally performing abortions in his Toronto clinic. Although complex, the case hinged on a specific point of law, whether the Criminal Code provisions on abortion unjustifiably infringed a woman's right to life, liberty, and security of the person under Section 7 of the Charter. Although the judgment is also complex, the court found that the abortion section of the Criminal Code infringed the woman's right to security of the person, that the process by which that woman was deprived of this right was not consistent with the principles of fundamental justice, and that the infringement of the pregnant woman's right to security of the person was not proportionate to the objective of protecting the fetus, and the means were not reasonable. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, I'm getting there. Over 30 years after abortion was decriminalized in Canada, the Conservatives are continuing their anti-choice activism by introducing a bill like this one in Parliament. Their assaults on women's rights are paying off politically when it comes to pleasing the religious right. One last thing, the Bloc Québécois must vigorously reject Conservative attacks on women's integrity and their right to self-determination, for the hard-won right of a woman to have control over her own body. Thank you very much.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm actually not pleased to have to rise today to speak on Bill C-311, another attack on a woman's right to choose, another attack on abortions as health care, another attack on abortion rights as human rights, something that women in particular led the way to have that right so that we wouldn't go back to dark times of what has been mentioned so many times today, back alley abortions where women died bleeding to death. Gruesome. And we're talking about violence, and I can't think of anything more violent than restricting a woman's right to health care, including the right to access a safe abortion. Bill C-311 amends the Criminal Code to specify that knowingly assaulting a pregnant woman and that causing physical or emotional harm to a pregnant woman are to be considered aggravating circumstances for sentencing purposes. But we know, as has been indicated over and over and over again in this debate, that these changes are in fact unnecessary, as judges already have the ability to apply more significant penalties for aggravating circumstances under Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code. No, in fact, Madam Speaker, no anti-violence organizations have asked for this legislation. And as somebody who has been on the front lines fighting against gender-based violence for many decades, I find it insulting to conflate an attempt to attack women's reproductive rights with true actions to end the ongoing crisis of gender-based violence. No Violence, anti-violence organization, as I indicated, has asked for this legislation, and the federal government can and should pursue other ways, in fact, as well, of addressing gender-based violence, including reversing the planned $150 million cut to women's shelters in September. If we want to protect women, including women who are pregnant, we need to make sure that they have a safe place to go. Let's not talk about the safety of women when that's not what we're really talking about, when we're attacking women's rights to make a choice about their bodily autonomy. I also call on all members of this House to instead focus their attention on pushing all levels of government to implement the 231 calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, and strengthening the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence by adding timelines and accountability measures. Why aren't we discussing that today? Why are we discussing a bill that threatens a woman's right to health care, which includes a safe abortion? This is disturbing.
The Honourable Whip for the Opposition on a point of order, yes?
Madam Speaker, we're here to debate a bill, a specific bill. And now speaker after speaker, including the present one, is talking about irrelevant issues. There is nothing in this bill about health care.
The Honourable Member knows that there's quite a leeway in how members approach bills.
Madam Speaker, do you find this relevant?
I haven't listened to the past 2 minutes or so. I was discussing with the table officer, but before that I thought it was relevant to the bill in question, but I will pay closer attention henceforth. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Anti-choice organizations, on the other hand, are cheering on the introduction of this bill. They see it as a step forward establishing legal protection for fetuses, which would pave the way for legal restrictions on abortion. If the bill passes, it will be a victory for those who want to limit abortion rights and will not do anything to meaningfully address gender-based violence. And I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, to hear that the member from Carleton has not advanced in his positions on women's rights, actively supporting this legislation when he has a history of supporting legislation that violate a women's right to choose. And may I add, Madam Speaker, the member of Carleton also has a history of supporting individuals, including Jordan Peterson, who attacks the trans community because he also has a history of not respecting.
I have to interrupt the Honourable Member. There's a point of order. Point of order from the Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Madam Speaker, she is not referring to the bill at all. She is defaming and abusing.
Winnipeg Centre was referring to the bill.
Referring to Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has absolutely nothing.
And that is debate, but the Honourable Member was referring to the bill 2 minutes ago, and I was listening this time. She was referring to the bill, and she's using some arguments that she is free to use to make her points. Well, the Honourable Members have a certain capacity to use arguments to defend their points, and that's what the Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre is doing. L'Honourable député de Mirabel dans le...
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Point of order. Since the beginning of debate, I understand that it's a delicate topic, but there's vocal interference from the Conservatives, Madam Speaker. I think it's my right as a parliamentarian to attend debates without disturbance, and I think this is going beyond the limits that perhaps there should be intervention, Madam Speaker.
C'est un autre.
That's another topic.
The Honourable Member for Sartori-White Rock.
Madam Speaker, and I think you would agree with me, it is my right as a Member of Parliament to raise a point of order, bring it to the Speaker's attention when I think it is appropriate, and I will not be shut down.
No, the Honourable Member for Mirabel was not referring to the rising on points of order. I think the Honourable Member was referring to comments that were being made while other members were speaking. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just going back, the member from Carleton has a history of supporting, anti-choice legislation that impacts a woman's right to choose, including now his support of Bill C-311, and again backing up and holding up folks like Jordan Peterson, who has spoken out aggressively against the trans community and their right to bodily autonomy. This is about bodily autonomy and the right to choose here. It's very much part of the debate. In fact, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada opposes this bill, saying the following, in quotes, "The Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada opposes this bill and urges MPs to oppose this bill as well. This bill is redundant, and the anti-choice movement is using it as a vehicle to advance fetal rights. Several anti-choice groups have been promoting this bill C-11 as a means to recognize two victims. They are looking for a route to establish fetal personhood in the law. If this bill passes, they would leverage the bill for that purpose." This is very much an anti-choice bill, Madam Speaker, and this is not coming from me, Madam Speaker, although there's been points of order raised. I know what I'm saying might be troubling, but I want to let you know that the NDP opposes Bill C-311, and we are committed to fighting for the reproductive rights of all Canadians. We oppose And I'm proud that we oppose that restrict anything that restricts these rights and support expanding access to abortion services and removing barriers and protecting the woman's right, the right of a woman and gender diverse people to make decisions about their own bodies, Madam Speaker. That's what this debate is about tonight. And from my perspective, and certainly we've heard from several experts in the field, this bill is the latest attempt in a long line of attempts by anti-choice Conservative MPs to undermine Canadians' reproductive rights. Now, I know not all Conservative MPs are anti-choice, and I urge them tomorrow to vote against the bill. It's unfortunate the leader of the Conservative Party is supporting an anti-choice legislation. We are opposing the bill that does not provide pregnant women with additional protection, but does provide anti-choice MPs and organizations with a new tool to promote the legal restrictions on abortion. Look at what's happening south of us. I am worried that we will have, like is happening in the States, 10-year-old girls that are victims of sexual assault being forced to carry babies to term. Yeah. Do we want a country that forces that kind of abuse on children? New Democrats are going to resist vocally and resist any sort of attempt to limit abortion rights. We can ensure that a pregnant woman and others who experience gender-based violence are safe. That is not what this bill is about. We can ensure that pregnant women are safe without undermining reproductive rights and the right to bodily autonomy for anybody, including the trans community. We know abortion rights are under attack. This is a real threat even in this country. And we must do more than oppose bad legislation. We already need to approve, for example, in real time, access to this right. There are places in Canada where you can't even access an abortion. We have to ensure that we don't just recognize that human right, that we ensure that all women have access to the right. And we know that Conservatives cannot be trusted on this issue. That's right. We know that. They have had several attempts to undermine a woman's right to choose and gender-diverse individuals. Because we know that many Conservative MPs have introduced and supported anti-choice bills that would undermine Canada's right to access a safe abortion. And quite frankly, the Liberals have talked a good game, but their record is deeply underwhelming because while they pay lip service to defending abortion rights, they still haven't removed the charitable status from anti-choice crisis pregnancy centres and won't enforce the Canada Health Act when provinces fail to uphold the right to access abortion. They need to take action, not worse, to ensure that a woman's right to health care, abortion is health care, is available. And we're going to continue to hold the government account, and I will continue to watch the new leader of the Conservative leader, the member from Carleton, who is actively supporting a bill that
Time is to return to resuming debate to the honourable member for South Surrey White.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am honoured to stand today in support of Bill C-311, the Violence Against Pregnant Women Act, because I thought that is what we are debating tonight. But what I've been listening to is far from that. The speakers have gone far afield in their discussion of a bill that is squarely before them. I want to thank the member for Yorkton Melville for bringing forward this important legislation, and it is my honour to second it at this stage of debate. And I will speak to this bill, not some other bill or other bills or a history of bills. We are talking about Bill C-311, which amends the criminal code to specify that knowingly assaulting a pregnant woman and that causing physical or emotional harm to a pregnant woman are to be considered aggravating circumstances for sentencing purposes. I support this bill because mothers who have faced and are facing violent assaults need to know they are heard and that their pain and depression caused by harm to their babies is not left unseen by others. I have fought for women's rights all my career as a lawyer, and especially during my career as a family lawyer, and now as a politician. This bill is about the rights of pregnant women. No more, no less. Madam Speaker, I am the mother of 4 children I've been fortunate to raise into adulthood, but I was pregnant 5 times. My last child, a boy named Mackenzie, or Little Mac for short, never got the chance to know his family, to work, to speak, to go to school, play with his friends, or grow up. His waiting family, me, his dad, his brother, and 3 sisters, never got to meet him. We lost little Mac halfway through my pregnancy because of the negligence of an interning doctor who wrongly handled an amniocentesis procedure and suffocated him in utero. His loss sent me at the time into a deep situational depression for months. I was off work for the first time in my adult life, and I grieved his passing desperately, and I still do, many years later. Because of this tragic event in my own life, I know and understand how the deliberate act of another, someone who knows you are pregnant and does harm to you and your baby, impacts a mother and her family. It is well documented that pregnant women in Canada are easy targets for violent assaults, yet the consequences of these offenses have not increased. Just this year, an Ontario Court of Appeal overturned a 7-year sentence for an offender who stabbed the pregnant mother of his unborn child in the neck and left her for dead. The mother lived, the baby didn't. This violent attacker's sentence was up to 15 years when an appeal judge pointed out that the initial sentence didn't address the issue of domestic violence or that the victim was pregnant with his baby. A violent crime against a pregnant woman needs to be treated as the serious crime that it is. Right now, criminal sentences in Canada do not consider harm done to a pregnant woman when an assault is committed. Nelson Mandela said that, and I quote, "Safety and security don't just happen. They are the result of collective consensus and public investment," end quote.
You're here.
Violence against women, especially pregnant women, is not a private family issue. It is a public safety and security issue and needs the urgent attention of this House. Among Canadian women who have reported being abused by an intimate partner during pregnancy, 40% said that the abuse began during pregnancy. In recent years, there have been more than 70 cases in which pregnant women have been murdered and the death of the unborn child was not a factor. The effect of the death of the unborn child was not a factor at sentencing. The story of Tashina General from Brantford is particularly disheartening. In 2008, a Brantford man strangled Tashina to death. She was his 21-year-old pregnant girlfriend. He then attempted to hide Tashina's body by burying her in a shallow grave. He committed this gruesome and horrific crime against Tashina, as the evidence came out, simply because he didn't want to bear the responsibility of being a father, despite Tashina's choice to be a mother. Only 8 years later, this murderer was set free. Tashina's grandmother, Norma General, still wonders what her great-grandson would have looked like and what kind of personality he would have had. She never had the opportunity to hold her first great-grandchild because of the despicable actions of a misogynistic killer. It's not only intimate partner violence to which pregnant women are vulnerable. Pregnant women are also the target of unprovoked attacks by strangers. Last year in Vancouver Island, a pregnant woman walking down the street with her 4-year-old daughter had a brick thrown at her stomach in a random attack. The fact that the victim was pregnant was not seen as an aggravating factor. Let that sink in. In another case, a pregnant woman in Surrey was attacked at a bank. An unknown man approached her from behind and violently threw her to the ground. Women who are pregnant are vulnerable, Madam Speaker, and they should be treated as vulnerable when it comes to sentencing. Offenders will often cite unplanned pregnancies or the stress caused by having to potentially financially support the baby as excuses for these crimes. This uncaring government has turned its back on women who choose to have a child. They are blinded by their differences with the member for Yorkton Melville on other matters, and that is blinding them to this bill. A vote against this bill is a vote against choice, against women, and it is misogynistic. They say that they're for choice, but only if we agree with that choice, and that is not choice at all.
The honourable member will have 3 minutes to finish her comments when the bill next comes to on the order paper. The time provided for the consideration of private members' business has now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper. Orders of the day.